My name's up there, but look, the FIRESCAPE project, which has been going on for the last decade or so, could really not have occurred without a series of collaborators. So in the audience, Karen King, I think, is here. Ian Davies, who asked a question before. John Marsden Smedley. Who else is here? Malcolm Gill, who's collaborated on the most recent project. And people who aren't here, Bob Keane, Bob Keane, who we heard from yesterday, Mike Flanagan from the Canadian Forest Service, Ross Bradstock, Adrian Perk, and a whole series of others who I haven't mentioned. So I'm really presenting on behalf of a large number of people that have contributed to this project. That's a little bit dark, but a couple of people in the room will recognise that slide. Coop, you were there. That's the Bendora fire on the afternoon of the 12th of January 2003, breaking the containment line, which was Mount Franklin Road. I think, Phil, you were there as well, standing on the other side taking photographs. If there wasn't a fire in the way, I'd have a nice photograph of Phil up in the Brindabella Range. So we're interested in modelling fires in landscapes, not just fire events, but fire regimes. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about the concept of the fire regime, then talk a little bit about the FIRESCAPE model, the model structure and some model evaluation, and then present two series of applications, if you like, climate change studies, one for the ACT region, and then a more recent study just published this year, looking at moist versus arid environments and the effect of climate change on fire regimes, and then fuel management. Prescribed burning effects and the relative importance of fuel management in relation to other factors affecting area burn in landscapes. And then, as asked by the organisers, to think about some critical needs to think about in terms of engaging with end users using this research. Now, Malcolm Gill published a really important paper in 1975 which introduced the concept of the fire regime, and here's just it's almost a quote. I've had to put a couple of parts together. The components of a fire regime are the variables of fire intensity, frequency of fire and season of occurrence, and fire type. And I'm not going to go through these. I think you have a fair idea, the people in this room have a fair idea of what these mean. Fire type really refers to below ground fire, like peat fires, compared to what we would call bushfires, like you can see on the screen there. So what FIRESCAPE is about is it's a simulation tool for modelling fire regimes in landscapes and then applying that to think about things like climate change and fuel management. It's important because fire regimes have important ecological effects. For example, here's an alpine ash stand up on Old Mill Road in the Brindabella Range, not long after, about a year or so after the 2003 fires. The alpine ash, Eucalyptus delicatensis, in the foreground there has been killed by fire and regenerated from seed. And here we can see that stand, 10 years, a decade or so after the fire. This is one of our bushfire courses from the ANU up there doing some field work. This species takes a certain amount of time to mature and produce a seed bank which will determine whether or not it'll survive after the next fire. And the time to maturation is still under question, and Michael Doherty, who's in the audience, is looking into that as well. These ones have largely not matured. If another fire had come through, if the interval is too short, then it's likely that the density of this population will decline on the site. Fire regimes, in one way or another, are also important for constructed assets. We're just talking about natural assets. Here's a photograph taken near Flowerdale after the 2009 fires. And of course, it's going to be the frequency and the intensity of fires in landscapes and their interaction with constructed assets that will determine the likelihood of outcomes like this. And so that's why we're interested in climate change. Ecological and constructed assets will be determined by resultant effects. So on to the FIRESCAPE model. FIRESCAPE is a system for simulating fires and therefore fire regimes in landscapes. And initially the model runs on a daily or a daily time step and a regional spatial scale. And I think the largest area that we've simulated, Karen can help me here, is about 4 million hectares in Central Australia. And the model can run for hundreds up to 1,000 or so years, if you're thinking about paleoecological studies and the like. Initially, weather is generated in the model. Either generated or read into the model. We have played around with weather generators. They're a little bit difficult because they don't catch the tail end of the fire danger index distributions, for example, particularly well, or you can read in daily weather from bureau-type sources. Then the empirical models are used to generate the location and timing of ignitions in the landscape. Once a fire ignites, then the model switches to, say, an hourly time step operating at the site, which might be 1 hectare. And all of the models that we've heard about or know about are then implemented to start to implement fire spread on the landscape. So, for example, Keach-Byram's drought index or Mount Soil Dryness Index. Extrapolations are made for hourly site weather. Like we heard in the last talk, depending on the vegetation type, a number of fire spread algorithms are implemented. It might be MacArthur's rate of spread, Neil Burrows' spin effects rate of spread, John Marsden Smedley's button grass spread, depending on where you are. Wendy's heathland spread we've used as well. And then, like the last couple of talks, various processes for spreading fire across the landscape are invoked. Depending on the weather conditions, the slope and the fuel conditions, the fire will successfully spread or not to a range of neighbouring pixels. If it spreads to a neighbouring pixel, then the process starts again and the fire continues to spread across the landscape. If it doesn't, then the fire extinguishes. A fire will impact on a pixel and have an effect on the fuel and vegetation dynamics in between the fires, and so the fuel will depend on the time since fire, etc. So this cycles through, and a number of fires are simulated across the landscape, and then these are built up over time to get an idea of the fire regime. I've put little stars there given the nature of this symposium. The CSIRO and the Commonwealth Fire Research has influenced or developed or evaluated these various modules, etc. And so without all of that work, none of the fire regime modelling work that we've done would be possible. Here's probably the earliest case study of the FIRESCAPE model in the ACT region. There's a digital elevation model, and you all know how to read those. Implementing the model, skipping over a whole bunch of decisions and assumptions that need to be made. The model can be run for 500 years or thereabouts and start to simulate spatial variation in aspects of the fire regime across the landscape. This is the simulated fire interval, and to try and get an idea about how it might vary from one place to another, you can also look at fire intensity and season of fire occurrence. The first thing that you like to do when you develop a process-based model like this is to start to think about calibration. And here's an example. I'm just going to talk initially about this Alice Springs study, one we did with Karen King, and then I'll come back to the Tasmanian one a little bit later. There's another digital elevation model there. John Marsden Smedley was responsible for generating this data and the next slide. It's a pretty large area, it's about 4 million hectares, which encompasses part of the Western McDonnell Ranges in Central Australia. Fire-prone environment, as you know, is driven by various aspects of weather dynamics and the aspects to do with fuel discontinuities and the like. Other speakers have spoken about that in this symposium. And there's information on past fire history, and thanks to John Marsden Smedley, who spent 12 months out in Central Australia collecting information on vegetation and fire history for this project. With the blink of an eye, Karen implemented the FIRESCAPE model, which is jumping over a lot of blood, sweat and tears in Central Australia. And we can see the observed fire history in the blue line. This is a fire size frequency distribution. So there's the frequency or the proportion of fires larger than a certain size on the horizontal axis there versus the simulated data. And this always requires some calibration. The extinguishment thresholds, the number of ignition attempts on an ignition day and the like, to get some sort of reasonable match. You don't just implement the model and switch it on and you get some sort of match like that. But that's one way of calibrating the model and seeing if you can match the simulated versus the observed fire size frequency distribution. Other aspects of evaluating the model is to compare it to empirical information. Here's some work by Jeremy Russell-Smith and others. And they looked at various aspects of fire occurrence across Australia in various regions based on rain class. And for example, they've looked at satellite-determined fire-affected area. Just up there you can see the location of the FIRESCAPE model in the ACT, and we can compare that, the statistics if you like, from the empirical observations to the simulated. Here's one that looks at the season, area burned by season. You can see the modelled information in the white bar and the fire-affected area right across this region, which is a pretty big region. It'd probably be better to, over time, collect the specific information for the modelled area. But nevertheless, there's a reasonable match. The fire occurrence by season is an emergent property. We don't put that in. That results from putting together all these empirical models about fire behaviour and fuel dynamics and seeing what happens. We've made a comparison. There's the ACT simulated data again against things like tree ring studies, and this is one of John Banks's, the late John Banks, a good colleague and friend who did work on fire occurrence in tree rings in the Brindabella range, and comparing the frequency of fire scars, particularly say in a pre-European period, against simulations from the models. There, on the vertical axis, you have the average interval between fire and years. The model is in white there. The observations are in the grey colour. And you can make what you like of that. What I make of that, it was a pretty soft test, because most of these sites are taken from along the Brindabella range, and they have more or less the same fire interval. What would be better would be to take sites from some of these valley sites versus the higher elevation sites to get more variation in the test data. The problem is, in some of those other locations, the annual tree rings don't show up particularly well, and you can't get a good fire history from the tree rings. And so it's about, the availability of test data to test the models. The traditional home of FIRESCAPE, if you like, is in the ACT region, and I've just put the references up there, and you can match that back. I put all of the references in the handout of abstracts for this symposium. Karen King, in her PhD and postdoc work, did a lot of work in southwest Tasmania and in Central Australia. I mean, we generally worked as teams on these, and many of the authors are involved in most of the projects. We've already heard a little bit about the West Macdonald Ranges. Ross Bradstock led a project, and Ian Davies did a lot of the programming of the FIRESCAPE model in the Sydney region. And we've heard from Bob Keane, and people would know about Mike Flanagan, and I've also implemented the model in Glacier National Park in Montana and compared it to the behaviour of some of the US fire regime models. I'm just going to talk about climate change and then prescribed burning or fuel management. And this is an old slide, and many people might have seen this before, but I just thought I'd put it up for those people that haven't seen it, but just to give a historical perspective on FIRESCAPE and its application. This is it's a different colour scheme, but it's a similar simulation to what we've seen before from the recent using historical climate and simulating fire intervals across the landscape. You could develop maps of fire intensity and season. This is just fire interval, and this is the sort of landscape that you can see. This is taken just after the 2003 fires in the Brindabella range. The model runs, and we've calibrated and evaluated and worried about it and discussed it. And then thought, how can it be used in an experimental sense? And here's the results of a fairly simple experiment, and that's changing the climate, increasing the temperature by 2 degrees, reducing precipitation with the climate change scenarios that were current at the time of the simulations, reducing relative humidity a little bit in line with the CSIRO projections, etc., and seeing what happens. And there's the result. And so really what it is what's the sensitivity of the simulated fire interval to changing the climate in this particular way? And it's a pretty dramatic result, partly because of the colour scheme chosen, and you can be a little bit more objective by producing some black and white graphs, which we've done. I'm not going to show them here because we don't have time. But increased fire area, and that's consistent with our understanding and consistent with the projections for fire changes in fire danger index, etc. But really the value of these models is to start to think about why on earth do you get a result like that? What's driving it? And we can look at the simulated dynamics of fire through time. And it's not a vast increase in fire intensity at the higher intensity end of the spectrum. In fact, there's not a significant increase in fire intensity overall. What it is an increase in the events where fires persist in the landscape rather than extinguish at the lower intensity end. And it wasn't really until that these simulation results came out that we could really think about and explore that. So it actually gives you some heart, because fire managers, and there's a lot of fire managers and land managers in the room, are pretty good at extinguishing relatively low intensity fires compared to the higher intensity fires. So it's a matter of thinking about going forward in terms of climate change, what the response might be. And it probably indicates, and we probably would have come to the same conclusion without the simulation models, that an emphasis on, for example, rapid initial attack of fires when they occur is going to be critical in preventing outcomes like on the right, under climate change as perhaps into the future. I told you this was coming, Karen. This is much more recent work just published this year in Global Change Biology, and it's a project that Karen, myself, Ross Bradstock and John Marsden-Smedley worked on over a number of years, and it's looking at the effects of climate change in two different locations, an arid location and a fairly moist location, to think about, well, theory would indicate that you would expect different outcomes in terms of climate change and fire regimes depending on the underlying moisture regime, and we set about testing that or evaluating that with FIRESCAPE, with this particular simulation model. So the first example was for southwest Tasmania, and you can see, for those of you that haven't been there, you should go there. But if you haven't been there, there's a photograph of what it looks like. It's a very moist environment. John Marsden-Smedley and others showed some photographs of fires in those particular areas. On the left there, you can see the results of some FIRESCAPE simulations. On the vertical axis is the median area burned across the simulation. I think this was about a 1.8 million hectare simulation in this particular case. The area burned and the number of fires in the point on the right-hand side there for the historical climate versus two climate change scenarios. Both for 2070, one is for the B1 emission scenario and one is for the A1 FI fossil intensive emission scenario, and I actually think the middle one's a little bit redundant because the world is tracking a much higher emission scenario circumstance. So this is indicating what we saw in the previous slide. Larger areas burned across those landscapes with a warmer, drier climate. This tends to be a couple of degrees warmer and significantly drier in terms of precipitation. There are places and circumstances in Australia where precipitation is likely to increase with the change in climate, and but this isn't necessarily one of them. So we've learned nothing new from the simulations that we ran a decade ago in this particular case. We then took the Central Australian model, and we can see an example of some fires in Central Australia, and we've talked and heard a lot about that in this symposium, so I won't really talk much about fire dynamics. But there's the results of running the climate change scenarios, historical versus 27 A1 FI fossil intensive, which is the emission scenario that the world looks to be tracking. A decline in the amount of area burned. And we often see here, the newspapers are often full of the stories about much more fire occurring in landscapes with climate change, and that's not necessarily going to always be the case. It depends on the underlying moisture regimes. And I go back to a comment by Andrew Stark in a bushfire CRC workshop, who said he couldn't get a word in edgeways, which I find hard to believe, but he sent me an email in the middle of this meeting saying, think about climate change in terms of moisture regimes. And it was a very insightful comment because we were thinking about the same thing at the same time. So I just sort of thank Andrew as an end user for supporting this work and thinking about the underlying importance of it. So there's something a little bit new and a little bit different in terms of climate change and fire regimes, and none of this, we couldn't have this discussion without the fire regime simulator. The discussion would be at the level of climate change and changes in forest fire danger index, perhaps annually some forest fire danger index, which is interesting and instructive, but it's quite different from the frequency and intensity of fires on landscapes. I've just put the figure legend down there for your information. Let's just have a think about, you use the models to unpick a little bit and understand what's going on, what's the underlying process. So there's no point just putting the model results up without having a discussion about it. Our colleague Ross, who was here on the first day, I don't think he's here today, published a very nice paper in 2010 which helped us understand what drives fires in landscapes. And this is called the 4-switch model, and the idea is that there are these key switches for fire occurrence in landscapes, and the amount of fire in the landscape depends on the rate at which each of these switches is switched on or switched off. The results that we got with a decline in area burned in Central Australia is a result of biomass growth declining. The drier climate results, in the model system at least, in decreased rates of spinifex fueled growth and decreased occurrence of well above average rainfall that results in a pulse of grassy biomass which overcomes those discontinuities between fuels. And so as the climate dries, fuel discontinuity effectively increases in the landscape and the amount of fire goes down. And it's nice to have a process-based explanation for the simulation results that we saw. In southern Australia, where the amount of fire increased, we think it's a result of increased availability of fuel. There's abundant fuel in southern Australia because of the higher productivity rates, unless it's been cleared or otherwise modified, but relatively abundant fuel, but it's relatively unavailable because of high moisture. The drier climate and warmer temperatures result in that being more available, and therefore the area burned goes up, is expected to go up. In both cases, the ambient fire weather, relative humidity down, temperature up, perhaps a little bit more wind, results in more areas burned, perhaps more so in southern Australia than central Australia. But what we didn't include in this was ignitions. And so climate change is nested within a global change context, which means changes in people and the density of people in landscapes. In some of these areas, the numbers of people will go down. In some areas in Australia, the numbers of people will go down. In some places, on the rural fringe of larger cities in Australia, the number of people will perhaps go up. And so we've got to do all the work again, thinking about changes in ignition rates. Just wanted to finish up in the last 5 minutes thinking about another application of the model, and that's to promote discussion about things like prescribed burning effectiveness. I put that slide up. That's Phil and Jim and others, and Andrew would recognise that slide as well. I think it was one of the plots at Project Vesta. I just wanted to thank Phil and Jim for inviting me to Project Vesta for a couple of weeks and learning a lot about fire behaviour and conducting large experiments, and Andrew for continuing our teaching collaboration with the fire science courses that ANU. I think it's been going on for more than 15 years in my case, but for much longer, with my predecessors. Some of the people in this room have taught that course before. Matthias Vore published a nice paper in Forest Ecology and Management a couple of years ago now, in 2009, that looked at, this is the Warra Regional Estate, I think it's called, I'd better check the name properly, in southern southwestern Tasmania, Western Australia, which looks at prescribed burning in the sense of, on the vertical axis, the area burned by unplanned fire versus the area burned by planned fire. And as you might expect, the more planned fire, the less unplanned fire in the landscape. But what's important about this line, and some of you might have seen it before, is the slope of this line here, the relationship between the two, which we might think of leveraged. And in this case, it's about minus 0.25 or a little bit more. About 3.5 units of prescribed burning required, or the effect of 3.5 units of prescribed burning will reduce the unplanned fire by about 1 unit. And so that's the leverage, it's the slope of the line. And it's an interesting question to ask, what do the simulation models say about this? This is what was observed over 50 years in Western Australia. Well, in this case, we can go and have a look in southwest Tasmania. We've talked about Karen's work there, and thanks to John, who provided this photograph by John Wilson. I think I'll restart later. And we can see a similar sort of result looking at prescribed burning in the landscape. And in the models, you can do a lot of things like prescribed burn or treat very large areas, up to 50% in this case of the button grass per annum, which I don't think you could really do. The land managers in the room could comment, I don't think you'd really do in the real world because of a whole range of constraints and its effect on the mean annual area burn. And so this is showing a similar result, and people have commented in print showing the similarity between this simulated result and the result that we saw in the previous empirical study. So there's another application of FIRESCAPE, and it's generated quite a lot of interest. The final thing is to think about the relative importance of this effect that we've just seen relative to other factors that affect fire behaviours. Here's a simulation experiment which took different patterns of fuel treatment in the landscape. This is what you'd call, we would call, broad area burning across the landscape, that the darker areas have lower fuel loads. In this particular case, we had different arrangements. You can simulate aspects of suppression, in this case rapid initial attack, from none up to very high, where you would suppress 3/4 of the point of the fires more or less at the point of ignition, versus variation in weather. So this is interannual variation in weather. This is actually from Glacier National Park. We'll see why in a moment. Where we have the average daily precipitation, the average daily maximum temperature. Each of these points represents a year, and you can see a lot of variation from one year to the next. So the question is, using these simulation type models, what's driving area burn? We know that they all affect area burn. We've just seen an example of prescribed burning affecting area burn, but what's the effect of prescribed burning versus, say, rapid initial attack or other aspects of ignition management versus variation in weather? This is a little bit complicated, but I'll just step through it. Here are the results. You run the model, and then you partition the variation in area burn according to those various factors and levels. Fuel approach and fuel management approach and fuel management effort, ignition management effort, variation in weather, and then what was described by the entire model. This means degrees of freedom. I put that in for you, Kurt, because you like statistics. He's gone. That's all right. And here's the results from the FIRESCAPE model. So it's saying around 20% of the variation in area burn was explained by variation in ignition management and about 40% by weather. The amount of variation is significant for the fuel management approach, but it's relatively low compared to these other factors. Now, the world is split on this. Half the world seems to say, well, that makes sense, and the other half the world says that must be wrong. So, here's an example where the fire regime simulation results have given us a tool, an output to have a discussion. The reason I wanted to put this work up is that we repeated this work using 5 landscape fire regime simulators from around the world. This is Ross Bradstock and others' CAFE model for the Sydney region, and you can see the results. Ian Davies, who asked a question before of Kevin, the Lamos landscape modelling shell. This one in Corsica, Ian?
Yeah.
2009 paper. Yeah, this one's for a European landscape. Ian spends a lot of time in Europe as well. The Landsun model, Bob Keen's model for the Northern Rocky Mountains, and the Semland model for boreal forest. The same experiment conducted independently in those 5 models, giving at least a consensus in the model results and as I said before, an instrument, an important point of discussion around these particular topics. I'm just going to finish now, Matt, and Andrew asked me to reflect on the critical needs in terms of land managers or end users and researchers in terms of collaborating in using fire regime models. Well, you've got to ask the right sort of question at the right sort of spatial and temporal scale. It's not about simulating individual fire events. It's about thinking about the occurrence of fires on broad spatial scales over long time periods. You require the right sort of data, elevation models, ignition location and timing. If you don't have that, you're not going to be able to make very robust simulations. Increasingly, we're seeing developments in rate of spread modelling, spotting modelling, etc., fuel and vegetation cover and dynamics. And, for example, we need to start thinking about the dynamics of surface and near-surface fuel hazard scores if we're going to be implementing these more in these landscape fire modelling tools. And most importantly, you need a mechanism for collaboration. This is not really a desktop tool or a web-based tool. I think the best example of collaboration was with John and Adrian in the Tasmanian Park Service a while ago now, where we worked very closely with the land managers to the point where the land managers were equivalent authors on the resultant scientific papers. They put a little bit of money in, but they more importantly put a lot of time and expertise in. And this project, took, I don't know, Karen, 2 or 3 years to come to fruition. And so finding the right mechanism for collaboration is really the key to using these sorts of models in operational management. Thank you.